Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Burchill, Director of Research and Engagement at Trends Research and Advisory. We're here today in Santa Barbara at the University of California, Santa Barbara with the Orfalea Center for Global International Studies on a project and conference called Constructions of Terrorism. I'm joined right now with Professor Mia Bloom, Professor of Communication at Ohio State University.
Georgia State University.
Georgia State, excuse me, I do apologize for that, Georgia State University. Mia, thank you very much for being part of our event. You're a very well-known expert on women and children and this whole radicalization process. I wonder if you could just give us some of your views on why is it that women and children are particularly vulnerable, or perhaps why we worry so much about women and children becoming radicalized?
I think that the events that happened in San Bernardino are an example where women actually can play an exacerbating role. They can actually be the spark for radicalization. I think for a very long time, we assumed that women always had a positive effect on the family, positive effect on politics, this assumption that, you know, with 1325, add women and you instantly have peace. And I think that we're seeing, first with Hayat Boumediene, who we now know radicalized Amri Coulibaly, who took hostages at the kosher market in Paris after Charlie Hebdo. And we've seen time and time again where women have a negative impact in terms of increasing levels of radicalization. This is very different than what used to be the case. In the 1970s, the way you got men out of a terrorist group was you married them off, they had a wife, a child, a mortgage, no time for terrorism. Now what many of these jihadi groups are doing is they're marrying the men off to women who are themselves, if not as radical, perhaps even more radical. And it's a way of ensuring that the man doesn't change his mind, doesn't leave, doesn't defect. And in fact, it reproduces terrorism because the children grow up with a mother who's informing their ideology and view of the world in the most radical way. So I don't know it's that we're concerned about the children until they grow up, because very few groups are using children while they're still children. But I do think that we're worried about the reproduction of terrorism for the next generation.
But is a lot of our worry sort of this misunderstanding or inability to understand women as violent actors? Is that, are we starting to change our views on that, or are we still stuck back in sort of the dark ages?
I think we're still stuck because I'm constantly asked by the media, are you surprised it's a woman? And I will always say, no, I'm not surprised. The very first terrorist was a woman for People's Will in Tsarist Russia, Narodnaya Volia. And, you know, she herself was involved with the assassination attempt against the Tsar. So women have been involved at least since, you know, the 1890s. And so this idea that we're still surprised, I think it's wishful thinking. I think that the feminist movement may have tried to promote this idea of sisterhood, which doesn't exist. We've seen women do horrible things in war. In the Rwandan genocide, we saw women not only perpetrate acts of violence against Tutsis, but the women sometimes help the men rape other women, which just runs counter to, I think, what we expect. So I do think that we're still stuck in this idea that women are a positive effect. Now, they can be. We have seen with CVE efforts, it's all about the mothers, both for good and for bad. But we do have to be realistic. When we look at radicalization, we shouldn't assume that radicalization will always be a male face.
And taking you up on this sort of countering violent extremism, should we treat women, young women, teenagers as a different category, or should we just be treating all young people, all adults as the same category? Are women slightly different in our efforts to ensure they don't fall into extremism?
I think with the young women, ISIS has been targeting, at least online, very young women, 14, 15, even as young as 12 and 13-year-old girls. And there's a reason, there's a very nefarious reason why they're doing that, because these are girls who can be easily swayed. And it's the same reason why pedophiles go after young girls online. And so I think that the young people, they need to have a different kind of conversation. We warn, and it's one of the things that I've seen in my research, is that the young women are very often approached by other women who are already in the caliphate, not by men, because we've warned these young girls to be careful about men online, but we haven't given them the same kinds of warning and the same kinds of tools to be able to, the ballast that they need to be able to resist. So what happens is you'll have someone like Aqsa Mahmood, who is the Scottish radiology teenager who disappeared and is now an ISIS bride. You'll have Huda Muthani, the girl from Alabama. You'll have the Halani sisters, the girls from the UK. The fact is that these women are dangerous. So maybe we need to treat the teenagers in a different way in terms of giving them the wherewithal to resist, but also in terms of how we are policing them.
Interesting. That's great, Mia. Thank you very much for your time.
This has been a fantastic conference. Very cool, very informative, and I've really enjoyed myself.
All right, thank you for being here. Cheers.
Thanks.